3 days after the battle ended, Corvin was still alive. He hadn't meant to be. The rest of the Ninth Border Company was buried in a mass grave behind the river fort, and he had been unconscious under 2 dead horses when the burial crew came through. They hadn't checked. Nobody checked when you were under 2 horses. He dug himself out on the 3rd morning, ate the last of the dried meat in his pack, and started walking north because north was the only direction with no army in it. He was 41 years old. He had fought in 4 wars. He had no home to return to, no wife waiting, no children with his eyes. He had a sword he hadn't cleaned in a week, boots with the left sole splitting open, and a wound along his ribs that had stopped bleeding but hadn't stopped hurting. His name had appeared on no heroic ballads. His commanding officers had respected him the way you respect a hammer, useful, reliable, replaceable. He did not feel bitter about this. Bitterness requires energy, and he had none. The valley he crossed on the 4th day was called the Hollow Reach on old military maps. Farmers had lived here once. The stone walls of their fields were still standing, though the fields themselves had gone to weed and ash. Dragons used this valley as a flight corridor between the coastal ranges and the inland peaks. Farmers learned that the hard way, then stopped being farmers. Corvin moved through it quickly, head down, the way you move through any territory that isn't yours. He smelled the blood before he saw anything. Then he came around a broken wall and stopped. The dragon was the largest creature he had ever been close to. Even dead, lying on its side across the ruins of what had once been a barn, it dominated everything around it. Its scales were the dark grey of old iron, and it had been beautiful once, he could tell even now. Something about the structure of its neck, the proportions of the folded wings. It had been killed by bolts. The heavy kind, the ones fired from siege rigs on wheeled frames. Someone had put at least 20 of them into it, which meant someone had prepared, which meant this was not an accident. He looked at the bolts for a long moment. He recognized the fletching. The Royal Extraction Corps, collectors, men paid by lords and wealthy merchants to harvest dragon parts, scales, claws, dried blood, for use in medicine and armor craft. The dragon had been ambushed. It hadn't even had room to take flight in this valley. He was already turning to leave when he heard the sound. It was small, high. It came from somewhere beneath the dragon's near foreleg, which was extended and curved slightly inward, the way a person curls an arm around something they're protecting. Corvin stood still. He was not a superstitious man, but he was a cautious one. The sound came again, then again, 3 distinct voices, close together, each slightly different in pitch. He recognized the pattern without being able to name it, the sound of young things calling for something that was not going to answer. He walked around the forelegs slowly. The nest had been dug into the foundations of the old barn. 3 hatchlings lay inside it, pressed together, no larger than hounds. Their scales were soft and pale, not yet hardened. Their eyes were open, 3 pairs of eyes, one set copper gold, one set grey, one set the pale amber of old glass, and all 6 eyes were fixed on him. None of them moved. They were too young to know whether he was a threat. They hadn't learned fear yet. They had only just learned the world. The largest one, copper gold eyes, a broad flat head, opened its mouth and showed teeth that were still milk-white and not yet dangerous. It did not hiss. It made a sound more like a question. Corvin crouched down slowly, which was something he'd learned years ago around spooked horses. Make yourself smaller. Let them see your hands. He had no idea why he did it. Force of habit, maybe. The smallest one took one careful step toward him on legs that still trembled a little with the effort. It was the pale amber-eyed one, smaller than the other 2, with a snout that still had fragments of shell stuck to it. It came within arm's reach and stopped. Then it made a sound that was not quite a word, but was trying to be one. Young dragons were said to have some speech from birth, borrowed from whatever language saturated the air around their nest. Their mother must have known the common tongue. It was coming through fragmented, rough, like voices heard through stone. What it said, what all 3 of them were slowly, exhaustedly saying, in the way of creatures who had been trying to say it for days to something that could not hear them anymore, was something close to. Where did she go? Corvin sat on the cold ground of the ruined barn and didn't answer, because there was no answer to give. He looked at the dead dragon. He looked at the extraction core bolts. He looked at 3 hatchlings who had hatched into a world that had already taken the only thing they had. He should leave. He was one man, wounded, with no resources. This was not his problem. This was not his world. Dragons and humans lived separate lives in separate territories, and that was, by all accounts, the arrangement that worked best for everyone. He reached into his pack and broke off a piece of dried meat and held it out. The small one sniffed it, then took it, then looked up at him with pale amber eyes that held no guile whatsoever, just hunger and cold, and something so raw he had to look away for a moment. He fed all 3 of them. Then he sat with his back against the dead dragon's flank, because it was the largest windbreak available, and waited to see what he was going to do next. He didn't leave. He named them because he needed something to call them, and because names made it easier to give orders, which was the only thing he actually knew how to do. The copper-gold one he called Rook, because it moved like a chess piece, direct, no wasted motion, always forward. The grey-eyed one he called Wren, because it was quick and darted sideways when startled. The small amber-eyed one he called Pip, which was not a fearsome name for a dragon, but she was not yet a fearsome dragon, and he thought she deserved a name that fit her now rather than one that fit what she was supposed to become. On the first night he taught himself what they ate, mostly by watching what they tried to eat and what made them spit and sneeze. Raw meat, yes. Insects, yes. Bark, no. River clay, apparently yes, which he didn't understand but stopped questioning after the 3rd time. They slept in a pile, generating heat between them, and when the temperature dropped after midnight they pressed against his legs without asking permission. He did not sleep much. He was listening for the extraction core. They came back on the 2nd day, not the full rig, just 2 outriders, circling back to check for intact eggs. Corvin heard the horses well before they came around the valley bend and moved the 3 hatchlings behind the most intact section of standing wall, pressing them into the gap between the stone and a collapsed roof beam. He gestured sharply with 2 fingers, the military hand's signal for stay still and be quiet, which he had no reason to think they knew. They knew, or they understood the intent well enough. All 3 went motionless and silent. Rook's eyes tracked the outriders through a crack in the stone, and Corvin watched Rook's jaw clench the way a soldier clenches a jaw, tightly, with control, not with calm. The outriders poked around the site for 20 minutes, didn't find what they were looking for, and left. When Corvin gave the all clear, Pip came out of the gap and walked directly to him and pressed her head against his knee. He put his hand on her neck without thinking about it. Her scales were warming toward their permanent texture, still soft at the edges, but the first hint of hardness coming in at the center. He spent the next morning working out a route north. The Hollow Reach Valley fed into a river corridor that would take them to the edge of the San Highlands, old land, unclaimed since the Crown gave up trying to tax it 2 centuries ago. Nobody built extraction core rigs in the Highlands. Too many competing warlords, too little infrastructure. If he could get 3 hatchlings across 40 miles of open ground without being seen, he might be able to reach Highland territory before anyone thought to look seriously. He had crossed worse terrain with worse odds carrying more weight. This was, he told himself, a logistical problem, not an emotional one. The problem with treating it as purely logistical became clear around midday when Wren found a dead crow, decided to investigate it thoroughly with both claws, and managed to fall sideways into a ditch that was deeper than she was tall. She was not hurt. She was furious. She made sounds that were clearly complaints. Her speech was developing faster than the others, whole syllables forming now, vowels she hadn't had yesterday. She said something that might have been unfair and might have been the name of the crow, and Corvin had to physically extract her from the ditch while she continued her objections. He set her on the bank. She shook herself. Then she very deliberately walked 3 steps away and sat with her back to him, which was such a specific and childlike gesture of wounded dignity that he made a sound he hadn't made in a long time. He had laughed. It surprised him more than it surprised her. He got them moving again. Rook led, always led, without being asked, scouting 10 yards ahead. Wren recovered her good humor within the hour and spent it asking questions she did not yet have enough words to fully form, so she asked them in gestures and sounds and occasional sharp looks that demanded answers. Pip stayed close to Corvin's left side, quiet and watchful. She was the smallest, and she had already learned, in 2 days, exactly where the slow leak in his boot sole was and walked on the other side of every puddle. He didn't know what to make of that. By evening they had covered 8 miles, which was reasonable for 3 hatchlings who hadn't been walking a week ago. He set up camp in the shell of an old watchtower, divided the last of his rations, and sat with his back to the warm stone while the sun went down. Rook sat beside him and looked north. His copper-gold eyes caught the last of the light and held it. He said, slowly and clearly, piecing the words together with the care of someone working in a language not quite their own. "You know the way." Corvin said he thought so. Rook was quiet for a while, then, "You came back. The second day you could have gone." Corvin said nothing. Rook didn't press. He lay down with his head on his forefeet and closed his eyes. Corvin leaned his head against the stone and looked at the darkening sky and did not examine too closely why he had come back, because he suspected the answer was something he was not ready to look at directly. Not yet. He just knew the highlands were 40 miles north, and that 40 miles was a manageable problem, and that was enough for now. The town of Velharrow sat at the last crossing point before the river turned west and the Sarn Highlands began. There was a bridge. There was also a garrison of 8 soldiers flying the Extraction Corps colors because the Corps had gotten smarter about where to put checkpoints. Corvin counted them from a hillside 300 yards out and spent a long time thinking. He could go around. The next crossing was 18 miles downstream, another 2 days, and the hatchlings were eating more than he could reliably forage. Pip had started coughing in the cold nights, not sick, not yet, but her lungs were not highland lungs, and the temperature was dropping as they moved north. 2 more days in open country with a coughing hatchling and no food buffer was a bad calculation. He could go through. 1 man crossing a bridge with 3 young dragons was not a subtle plan. It was, however, a fast one. He thought about it for an hour. Then he went back to where he'd left the 3 of them in a dense thicket and crouched down to their level. He explained it the way he'd learned to explain things in the army, plainly, without softening it. The bridge was watched. He needed to go ahead first and create a problem that pulled the soldiers' attention away from the river. When the soldiers moved, the 3 of them needed to cross low, fast, and without making any sound. He looked at each of them when he said the last part. Wren, who still complained about ditches, said with great seriousness, "We can be quiet." Rook said, "What kind of problem?" Corvin said the kind involving a small fire and a wagon wheel, and nothing that would get anyone killed. Rook considered this with the expression of someone evaluating a military plan. Then he nodded, which was a very human gesture he had picked up somewhere in the last week without apparently noticing. Corvin went into Velharrow from the south road. He bought nothing, said nothing to no one, and found the large wagon loaded with dyed wool that was sitting outside the dye house. He loosened 1 wheel pin until it was barely holding. Then he walked to the north end of the market and waited. The wagon rolled out of the yard 12 minutes later, loaded by a dye house worker who had no idea what was about to happen. It made it 30 feet before the wheel gave, tipped, and spilled an entire season of dyed wool across the main road directly in front of the garrison post. The garrison soldiers moved, all 8 of them, because wool was valuable and the dye house owner was already yelling, and the mess was spectacular. Corvin watched from the corner of a building and kept his eyes on the bridge. 3 small shapes moved across it in the time it took to say nothing. Low, fast, not making a sound. Pip went last, and she was the one he watched most closely because she was smallest and the bridge planks were old and loud. She crossed them like she was moving across ice, absolute deliberateness, 1 foot at a time, reading the surface before each step. They were in the tree line on the other side before any soldier turned around. Corvin walked across the bridge openly while the chaos continued behind him. He handed a coin to the one remaining sentry, who was too distracted to do more than pocket it and nod. He found them 50 yards into the trees. Rook was sitting in a way that projected calm, which meant he had been frightened. Wren was vibrating slightly with suppressed energy. Pip walked to Corvin and sat on his left foot, which she had started doing when she was cold. He felt her weight there and didn't move. They made the edge of the highlands before dark. The terrain changed immediately. The flat cultivated land behind them gave way to broken rock and old pine, narrow paths worn by deer, air that smelled of cold water and resin. The Corps didn't run rigs up here because the ground was wrong for the wheeled frames. This was, as close as Corvin could calculate it, safe. He sat against a pine and ate the last of what he'd bought in the valley behind them and gave most of it to the three of them, because they were still growing and he was not. Wren said out of nowhere, the small one at the bridge. She did not make a sound. I know, Corvin said. You were watching her. Yes. Wren thought about this because she is smallest. Because she's the one most likely to have trouble, he said. You watch the one most likely to need it. Wren looked at him with grey eyes that were getting sharper every day. She said, that is what she did for us, in the nest. She was always last, always watching behind. He didn't answer, he already knew. He had seen it in the first hour, the way Pip positioned herself, never ahead, always rearward, always watching the spaces the others left unwatched. A 3-week-old dragon who had learned to guard a flank without being taught. He had known soldiers with 20 years of service who hadn't figured that out. The highlands spread out above them, dark and cold and unmanaged. 3 hatchlings who a week ago had been in a nest were now in highland terrain and alive. Corvin pulled his coat tighter and looked at the stars between the pine crowns and thought about what came next. The highlands were safe, but safe was a temporary condition. Safe meant nothing if there was no permanent answer. He thought about the conclave, the dragon ruling council, the oldest institution in the world. They had neutrality agreements. They had territory, and they were, he knew from a treaty briefing 11 years ago that he'd half slept through, legally obligated to receive any young dragon brought to them under duress. He'd never thought that information would matter. It turned out most things you filed away and forgot eventually showed up needing to be remembered. The conclave sent 2 sentinels to intercept them 2 miles from the border markers. Corvin had expected this. What he hadn't expected was how they landed, not between him and the hatchlings, but in front of all 4 of them together, a detail that told him the sentinels had been watching them move for at least an hour and had already decided something. Both sentinels were old. Their scales had gone the dull silver grey of creatures that had stopped bothering with camouflage because nothing in the world required them to hide. The larger one looked at Corvin the way a scholar looks at a word written in a language they don't expect to encounter. It spoke in common tongue without condescension, only in the flat way of someone translating from their preferred language. It said, "You are human." Corvin said, "Yes. You have brought 3 young of the Ironscale lineage across the San Highlands on foot." Corvin said, "Yes." The sentinel studied him. "Why?" He said, "Because their mother was killed by the Royal Extraction Corps in the Hollow Reach Valley, and I was there, and they were not dead yet." Another silence. The second sentinel had moved around him while he was talking and was now looking at the hatchlings. Rook met the sentinel's gaze straight on. Wren edged sideways to get a better angle of the whole situation. Pip stood exactly where she had been standing and did not move, which was more composure than Corvin could claim the first time he'd stood in front of anyone with that much presence. The larger sentinel said, "We received word that an extraction crew had operated in the valley. We sent a scout." A pause. The scout reported the nest destroyed. "The eggs were destroyed," Corvin said. "These 3 hatched under her." The sentinel looked at the hatchlings for a long time. Something passed across its face. Not grief, exactly. The expression was too controlled for grief. but the flattening that happens when someone receives information that is not a surprise and is also not acceptable. It said, "Come." The conclave seat was inside a mountain that the maps called the Greyville. Corvin had seen it on campaign maps as a geographical reference, never as a destination. The inside of it was larger than seemed possible, not carved, grown, the stone shaped slowly over centuries into chambers that had no interest in human ideas about how a room should look. The ceilings were 200 feet above. The light came from mineral veins in the walls, old and cold and blue-white. There were 12 members of the Elder Council. They were the oldest living creatures in this part of the world. Some of them had been alive before the kingdom Corvin had fought for existed. He stood in front of them, alone, because the hatchlings had been guided gently into a side passage by a younger dragon attendant, and he had let them go, and he was trying not to think about whether that was the right call. The eldest spoke. It was enormous. Its scales had gone past grey into something closer to white, and it sat with the stillness of old stone. It said, "You are a soldier of the Arin Border Regiment." "Former," Corvin said. "The corps that killed this hatchling's mother was funded by a lord with ties to the Arin crown." "I know." "Then you understand," it said, "that your presence here with these three could be read as a political act." "I'm one man," Corvin said. "I have no politics left." "All humans have politics." "I had a pack of rations and nowhere to be," he said. "I fed them because they were hungry. I moved them north because staying wasn't safe. I'm here because your treaty says you'll take young under duress, and they qualify. That's all I have." The eldest was quiet for a moment. Then, "And yet you crossed 3 territories and a garrisoned bridge for 3 hatchlings who are not your species, not your kin, and not your responsibility." He didn't answer that. Another elder, deep red scales, very old, a scar running the length of its jaw that had been there long enough to become part of its face, said, "Do you know what dragons are taught about humans?" "I can guess." "Short lives," it said, "small range, limited understanding, high rates of violence toward things they don't own and things they do own equally." It paused. "We are not taught that you cross highlands carrying nothing to feed 3 of our young because you found them cold." Corvin said nothing. The eldest spoke again. "The young, how are they?" He thought about it honestly. "Rook's territorial, he'll need room. Wren's the fastest thinker I've met. She'll need something to do with that. Pip's the one you want watching your blind side." He stopped. He was aware he had just given a tactical assessment of 3 infant dragons to a council of ancients, and it sounded like he was recommending soldiers. He didn't take it back. The council went quiet, in the way of entities communicating through channels he couldn't hear. Then the eldest said, "The hatchlings will stay. They are of this lineage, and this is where they belong." Something in his chest moved sideways in a way he did not enjoy. "And you," it said, "will be permitted to see them, if you choose to return." He looked up at that. "It seems relevant," the eldest said, with the studied neutrality of something very old, admitting, carefully, that it had noticed something it had not expected to notice, to consider that they may not thrive as well without you. It wasn't thanks, it wasn't even warmth. It was simply the conclave acknowledging, in the most restrained possible language, that a human had done something that required them to adjust their records. He walked out of that chamber into the cold blue light of the mountain passage and stood there a moment, breathing. Then he went to find the side passage where they had taken Rook and Wren and Pip. 4 months later, the extraction corps found the conclave. Not the seat, they hadn't gotten that far, but a squad of 16 corps soldiers and 2 rig operators set up a mobile harvesting camp at the base of the Greyville, within the conclave's acknowledged neutral territory. They planted the camp like they owned the ground, which was the specific behavior of men backed by authority, so large they had stopped remembering that authority has edges. Corvin had been living in a rough camp 2 miles from the mountain for most of those 4 months. He had built it without being asked and without asking permission. The conclave had not told him to leave, which he took as license. He went in every 3rd day or so. He brought game he'd caught. He sat with the hatchlings while they grew, which they were doing with alarming speed. Rook was now the size of a draft horse and still accelerating. He watched Ren learn to read conclave texts because she had started demanding them and nobody seemed able to tell her no. He watched Pip watch everything, still quiet, still cataloguing, her amber eyes getting older looking by the week in a way that had nothing to do with time. He was sharpening a blade at his camp when the runner came, a young conclave attendant, barely trained to full speech, stumbling over words in urgency. Core camp, South Base, armed. He packed what he needed and was moving within 5 minutes. The situation at the South Base was exactly what he'd expected and worse than he'd hoped. 16 armed men who had set up quickly and with purpose. The rig frames were the new design, mobile, lighter, cable-based rather than bolt launch. Someone had spent money and thought on these. Someone wanted mature dragon parts, not hatchlings. Corvin had no authority here. He had no rank, no letter, no political weight of any kind. He was a former border soldier with a healed wound in his left shoulder and 11 years of experience watching better-equipped forces take ground from unprepared positions. He counted sight lines. He counted the positions of the rig operators versus the armed soldiers and understood immediately that the operators didn't think of themselves as fighters. They stood differently, they moved differently, they were watching the mountain and not watching their perimeter. He walked into the camp from the south. Not like a threat, not with his hand on his blade. He walked in the specific way of someone who belongs somewhere, which is the second most powerful disguise in the world after actual authority. He walked to the nearest operator and said, with no preamble, "You're inside the Grayville marker line. Your western anchor is on consecrated ground by 12 feet. The operator looked at him, and you are former surveyor for the Border Commission, he said, without blinking. Landmark arbitration, treaty boundary disputes, you've got a problem. Every military operation has one person whose whole job is to prevent paperwork disasters, and every extraction corps operation is secretly terrified of paperwork disasters because the legal exposure on territorial violations was severe. The operator found that person within 2 minutes. That person brought in the squad leader. The squad leader argued. Corvin argued back, citing the specific clause number from the Conclave Treaty that he had in fact memorized 11 years ago in a half-awake briefing and had never once expected to use. He bought 40 minutes. He didn't know what he needed 40 minutes for exactly. He only knew that any situation that was going bad needed time changed in it, and his job right now was to change the time. He found out what he'd bought the time for when Rook's shadow crossed the camp. Rook alone would have been enough, but it was not Rook alone. 6 conclave dragons came over the Grayville ridgeline, 3 young, 3 old. And all of them coming in at the angle that puts the sun directly behind you, which is a tactic as old as combat itself. The light turned them into shapes against fire and made it impossible to accurately assess their number or their size. The corps soldiers read the same thing Corvin read the very first morning in the Hollow Valley. The difference between a situation you're in control of and a situation you are not. They ran, not all of them. The squad leader stood his ground for a moment longer, because pride is a heavy thing to drop quickly. But the rig operators went first, and the soldiers followed, and the squad leader made his calculation and made it correctly. The rigs were left behind. Corvin walked to the nearest one and removed the cable mechanism in about 4 minutes, which made it useless. He did the same to the second. He was working on the third when Rook landed beside him. He was enormous now. Standing next to Rook was like standing next to a building that had opinions. He smelled like hot stone and pine smoke and something Corvin had no name for. Rook looked at the dismantled rig. He looked at the retreating soldiers in the distance. He looked at Corvin. He said, 40 minutes. Yes. You did that alone. Mostly talking, Corvin said. You made them argue about lines on a map, Rook said slowly, while we came over the ridge. Seemed like the most efficient approach. Rook was quiet for a moment. He said, "The conclave will not understand how you did that. None of them have ever won time by talking about paper." Corvin said, "Most problems are paper problems if you stand at the right angle." Rook made a low sound in his chest that Corvin had learned, over 4 months, was what he did instead of laughing. Then he lowered his head until his jaw was roughly level with Corvin's shoulder and held it there, the way he had started doing instead of whatever greeting he would have used with his own kind. Corvin put one hand on the broad flat of his snout. Behind them, the other 5 conclave dragons were already pulling the abandoned equipment apart with no particular delicacy. It was going to be an interesting report for whoever the Corps sent to investigate. The conclave summoned him in the deep of winter, when the Greyville was buried in snow and the wind came through the passes like something personal. He was not alarmed. He had been summoned 3 times before, once when the Corps had sent a diplomatic envoy trying to recover the dismantled rigs, once when Wren had set the West Archive on fire by accident while practicing a reading technique that involved too much breath control, and once simply because the eldest wanted to ask him how humans decided when to stop fighting. That last conversation had lasted 6 hours. He came in from the cold and stood in front of the council again, and this time the chamber did not feel the way it had the first time. He didn't know if the room had changed or he had. The eldest spoke. Its voice had gotten quieter over the winter, which Corvin had noticed and set aside because he did not want to think about what it meant. "The conclave has been in discussion," it said, "about the matter of you." He waited. "You have lived at the base of this mountain for 7 months. You have come inside its boundaries regularly, you have fed and trained, and we are using this word carefully, raised 3 of our lineage. You have used human methods and human knowledge to repel a corp operation that our own sentinels could not have stopped in the same way, because it required the specific kind of deception that requires understanding how humans think from the inside." He waited again. "We wish to offer you a formal position," it said. "Human liaison to the conclave. It is a role that has not existed before. It will require you to remain here indefinitely and to be available when your particular understanding of human systems is relevant." Corvin thought about this. He said, "The 3 hatchlings, that's part of this. They would remain within conclave territory, yes. Their development is," the eldest paused, choosing words, "not standard. They are learning things we do not typically teach at this age. Wren has petitioned twice to be included in council discussions. Rook has begun attending border sentinel training on his own initiative." Pip, a pause that sounded almost like affection, which Corvin had not expected from the eldest, "has reorganized the watch rotation at the North Pass in a way that is, we are told, more efficient." Corvin said, "She's been watching me organize things." "Yes," the eldest said, "we are aware." He looked at the 12 faces of the council, old beyond his understanding, each of them, living archives, creatures for whom a human lifetime was a medium-length chapter in a much larger story. They were offering him a place in that story, which was not something he had known to want until this moment. He said, "My methods won't always make sense to you. We are aware of that also. And I'll need to be able to move freely. There will be times I need to go into human territory and you won't want to know exactly what I'm doing." "We are," the eldest said, with the patience of something 4 centuries old, "accepting that this is part of the arrangement." He nodded. He thought about the border regiment he'd served in, the officers who had never learned his name, the mass grave in the field behind the river fought with his company in it, and the gap where he should have been. He thought about the specific quality of existing without mattering, which had been his life for so long he had stopped noticing it, the way you stop noticing a constant pain. He said, "Yes, I'll stay." The council dispersed with the quiet efficiency of entities who have other centuries of things to attend to. The eldest remained, sitting very still, and when the others had gone it said, "The young ones asked about this meeting, all 3 of them. What did you tell them?" "That the answer would be what it was, and that asking the conclave to hurry would not change it." A pause. Rook pointed out that you are not a creature who leaves things unfinished. He said it as though it were a self-evident fact about the nature of humans. Corvin said nothing. Is it, the eldest asked, self-evident? He thought about the hollow Reach Valley and 2 dead horses and a wound in his ribs and 3 creatures the size of hounds looking at him with eyes that had no guile in them yet. He thought about 40 miles of open ground and an extraction core bridge and a mountain pass in winter. He said, it depends on the human. The eldest considered this with the weight it gave everything, then and you. He left the chamber and walked through the cold blue light of the passage and came out into the great inner hall where the 3 of them were waiting, had clearly been waiting for some time, arranged in the specific way of creatures trying to look like they had not been waiting. Rook was sitting with his back very straight. Ren had a conclave text open in front of her and was not reading it. Pip was sitting closest to the passage entrance, which was not a coincidence. He walked to the middle of the hall and stopped. He said, I'm staying. Ren closed the text she hadn't been reading. Rook let out a slow breath and looked away at nothing, which was his method of displaying feelings he didn't yet have language for. Pip walked forward until she could press the flat of her head against his chest and stood there. He put both hands on the sides of her jaw and just held them there for a moment. He was 41 years old. He had survived 4 wars and 1 burial crew. He had crossed the San Highlands with 3 dragons nobody wanted and delivered them to a place that now wanted them very much. He had no army, no rank, no kingdom that counted him. He had this. He had learned late what he suspected the eldest had always known, that the truly dangerous creature is not the largest or the oldest or the one with the most fire. It is the one that looks at something fragile and cold and frightened and decides, without ceremony or reward, that it is theirs to protect. That decision, made once and kept, is the thing that cannot be defeated. He kept it.